Thank you very much. That was very inspirational. And if anybody eats organic food, we have the Rodale Institute largely to thank. Their work over the last couple of years has been fantastic. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
All right, so now in this portion of our show, we're going to talk a little bit about the intersections between food, farming, farmers, and climate change. And for me, this started probably about 7 or 8 years ago. I made the mistake of setting up a Google alert for climate change. And man, is that like a prescription for depression, because it's mostly gloom and doom. But luckily, through some of the most recent research and work, we've been finding a lot of information that I think is pretty hopeful. So, can anybody tell me what all of these entities have in common? Anyone? So 3 things. 1, they all believe that climate change exists, that it's human caused, and it's their biggest priority moving forward. So these aren't, greeny, hippie tree huggers. These are, really, the masters of industry and whatnot. You've got Nestle, one of the biggest food manufacturers in the world, the Department of Defense, the Vatican, you've got insurers, you've got everybody up there, and for them, this is a priority. And I only mention this because amongst friends and family, we certainly have people that fall into like this climate change denial camp. It's a reality and something we have to deal with. But it's not just sort of the usual, characters saying that climate change is real and it's a big deal. It's these folks right here. So that's just something to keep in mind. So when we usually hear about climate change, it usually falls in 2 camps. It's either one on the sort of, emission sides. It's dirty coal-fired plants, it's the Keystone Pipeline, or it falls into something around like renewable energy, technology, solar panels on your roof. But something's missing from the conversation is in large part having to do with food production. How we produce food, how we produce fibers, medicinal plants, and even body care products. So using some of the data from a consortium of groups, including the ETC group, GRAIN, and Via Campesina, what they've done is look at the breakout of the whole picture as it relates to food and farming. And that whole picture is that industrial farming largely is one of the bigger contributors to climate change. So it breaks down in a couple different areas. One, 11 to 15% is happening largely on the farm. Mechanization, pesticides, those types of things. But we also see a huge, creation of emissions, largely through land use changing, especially deforestation, for agro-export. So just this last week, The Guardian in the UK came out with a big study where the vast majority of all deforestation happening right now, not only in the global south, but also in Canada, is happening for exportation of agricultural goods. And it's mostly kind of the big uglies, GMO soy, corn, those types of things. And then one thing that's often missing is in this global food system is the whole production process. Whether it's food miles, packaging, production, all this contributes to climate change as well. There was a real important study that came out probably about 10 years ago. The average was that the average food item in the United States traveled like 1,600 miles. Sometimes it's way more than that, sometimes it's a little bit less. But the bottom line is our global food system is very global, and it's traveling in a lot of ways that aren't necessarily planet friendly. And then finally, the big one that we often overlooked is waste. And so this plays out in 2 different ways. In the global south, it's usually a problem of infrastructure, lack of refrigeration, roads, those types of things, processing. In places like the United States, we waste a lot of food. There was a University of Arizona study that came out maybe about 5 or 7 years ago, and it was estimated about 40 to 50% of our food we just simply throw out. And all that contributes to climate change as well through emissions. So what this plays out specifically in terms of food production, I think this is one thing that we often overlook, and not to be really kind of doom and gloom, but it's certainly a big issue that we're seeing across the whole globe. In terms of productions, one, we're going to see an increase, or I should say a decline in yield. And they're expecting by 2080 a decline anywhere between 15 to 20% in sort of like basic cereals. Certainly water pressure, as Coach mentioned, we're seeing drought right now in the food basket of the United States in Central California. This is something that we're going to be seeing in really critical areas moving forward. And then we also have this notion of kind of these increased extreme weather events. And the one example that I found particularly relevant for the line of work we do is there was a huge typhoon in the Philippines, and it wiped out tons and tons of coconut producers. And that had ripple effects across the globe. This is the kind of thing that is going to be happening increasingly so in the years to come and impacting big ways in the global food chain. And then one thing that really is kind of a bummer, if you ever want to look at your favorite food, coffee, cocoa, wine, grapes, you name it, they're all being impacted by climate change, and it's generally not good. So just to give you an example, right now, coffee producers in southern Mexico, throughout Central America, are dealing with a rust. Let's call it La Roya in Spanish. And what this basically does is, through climate change, we're seeing increases in pest infestation, and it's also with a couple of variations in degrees. Plants aren't flowering, we're having reproduction problems. So we're seeing a huge impact that's been happening, really, that we've been recording for the last 10 years plus, on producers throughout the world. And this is a big issue. And I should also say it's important here in the United States, for growers of stone fruit, there's winter chill hours, there's all these things that are very climate dependent. So by not addressing those, we're really kind of setting ourselves up to fail. So kind of shifting gears a little bit and talking about how this kind of plays out proactively and positively across the globe. 2014, according to the United Nations, was going to be this big year of celebrating the family farmer. And not only in the United States, but really abroad as well, we kind of have this romantic notion of family farmers, and we talk a lot about it in propaganda. But in reality, there's not a whole lot of oomph behind it. So there's a couple of things that need to be kind of taken into account when we talk about this, especially as it relates to food production and climate change. One, by and large, small farms, organic farms are much more resilient to some of these extreme weather conditions. So whether you're talking about Nicaragua, Cuba, or even New England, diverse organic farms largely can weather these events way better than industrial agriculture, especially monocrops. And in some cases, they actually have bumper crop years in many cases, and so we've seen that in a number of countries, especially Central America of late. The other thing that we often overlook is that small farmers, for the most part, really are reservoirs for biodiversity. On these monocrops or the big industrial plantations, you have one, in many cases, genetically identical crop that gets planted for many, many miles or hectares. Small farmers, by necessity, but through many, many years of development, have created really biodiverse, agro-biodiverse farms that not only benefit them in terms of their food production, but we also rely on them as well. So crop developers often have to go back to sort of centers of origin, like in Mexico, to find new varieties for development to address things in the United States as well. Another thing that's often overlooked with small producers is they're really reservoirs or safe areas that are GMO-free. Right now, as GMOs are really exploding, not only in the United States, but now really the new markets are, so to speak, in the global south. We saw a shift from recombinant bovine growth hormone here in the United States, and now that's actually taking hold in places like Brazil, for example. So it's kind of like the cigarette manufacturers, looks 10 years ago. Cigarette smoking was going down in the United States, so let's look at the developing world. Same thing with GMOs. And another important fact that we talk about, and I think this is really relevant when we talk about food and famine and whatnot, and can organic feed the world, the bottom line is that the some 900 million small farmers are growing the vast majority of food for humans on only a quarter of the land. So that's really important to realize. And then finally, as Coach has mentioned, there's been a number of really good studies and data that small farms and organic farms are far more productive than industrial farms. Not only are you getting, sort of your basic food crops, but you're also getting fodder for animals, medicinal plants, a whole host of things. So a corn farm in Mexico versus a corn farm in Iowa, they may not produce the same amount of corn per hectare, but you're also getting a lot more bang for your buck on the smaller biodiverse farms. And then, as Coach mentioned, the organic farms are far more productive. They use far less energy. A lot of the sort of industrial farms, whether it's the grain belt in the United States or other areas, they're basically net energy losers. It takes more energy to go in to produce less food in terms of kilocalories. So that's something to keep in mind. So the one thing farmers over history in the United States and in the global south, they're really marginalized in many cases. They don't have the big money as some of the industrial farms. They don't have the lobbying power. And in a way, they're kind of like, we're killing the goose with the golden egg, If we want to be able to employ this regenerative organic agricultural model, we need people to do it. And it's not going to be, sort of the masters of industry, but it's actually going to be farmers with the traditional knowledge and the land that are actually feeding people to do it. And so there's a lot of examples, but there's a couple of things that I think are particularly relevant. One, what we're seeing as a result of the 2008 financial crisis is this move, kind of like a recolonization. Big food-producing companies or big manufacturers are buying up huge tracts of land, not only in the United States, but throughout the global south as well. And what this is doing is really pushing off people that are producing the food with the traditional knowledge off, migrating or into urban areas. And I think, in the last 10 years, there's been about 100 million hectares of land that have been grabbed up by multinational firms. The other issue really deals with these free trade agreements. NAFTA, the World Trade Organization, and others, they're really built up in a way that benefits agri-industry. Small farmers are not at the table, and the impact has been pretty bad. So all of the data, for example, with NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, especially with small farmers that produce corn in Mexico, we've seen a huge flood of exported corn from the United States. Thanks to subsidies, they've been produced less than the cost of production, and that has had a huge impact on corn producers, displacing them from their lands, sending them into migration or urban areas, and then we're also losing that land and traditional knowledge. So that's pretty important. Genetically modified organisms, or GMOs, are certainly an issue. That's something we'll see increasingly so, not only by companies really kind of forcing their way into new markets, but also through genetic contamination, and that's something we see with corn in Mexico as well. So it's just a good sort of example of what we can look at. And finally, there's a couple of things that I call Trojan horses that are being discussed right now. One is the United Nations kind of reduction in emissions deforestation program, which is involved in this carbon offsetting credit program, which is not necessarily working. And then another thing we'll be hearing about in the near future, which is climate smart agriculture, which on its surface sounds good, but in terms of how it's going to be employed, maybe not so good. You've got the likes of Monsanto, the Gates Foundation, and from their mind, they think of like no-till associated with GMO is really the way forward for farmers. So these are things that are kind of out there, and you should be aware of. So the one thing, at least for me in dealing with my own depression around this issue is, it almost seems like Debbie Downer from Saturday Night Live is involved in like our PR firms for climate change. It's really, it's tough. It's like we hit that 350 mark for parts per million of carbon dioxide, or all the way to 400, like what can we do? So I think what some of the work that Rodale has done and others has been really great because it gives people hope. So I always like this quote from Harvey Milk. He was the first openly gay elected official in the United States. And the bottom line is we got to give people hope. Like hope motivates folks. If we talk about sort of these like cold hard numbers without really many alternatives, that's demoralizing. And so we have to really think about hope any way we can as we look forward to the future. So talking a little bit about some of the interesting things, both on the positive and negative side for moving forward, both on mitigation, adaptation, and reversal, there's a couple of things that I just want to kind of touch on before we open it up. Given our sort of work in fair trade with a specific focus on small producers in the global south, there's a couple of things from our own personal experience that I think is actually pretty important and something that I think should be continued to move forward throughout the global south. So in my own personal kind of working with Dr. Bronner's subsidiary, Serendipalm, in Ghana's eastern region, we work with a couple hundred small producer farmers that grow organic and fair trade oil palm. So on its face, that's great, and consumers like that. But how this plays out in terms of climate change and emissions, I think, is also interesting as well. And thanks to the sort of the fair trade funds that go along with this, we've been able to do a number of really interesting things. So for example, recycle all of our biomass back to the farms, which really boosts up our fertility. It keeps the farmers producing at a high level, keeps them on the farm, and does really quite well for kind of our agroforestry efforts. So this is all the biomass and waste that we see. We use cover cropping throughout our small orchards. We're looking at anywhere between 0 to 5 hectares, which isn't that, it's not a lot of land. But this is something that, we deal primarily with the small farmers. We use mulch, obviously. We recycle our waste. Some of the effluent from the process goes back and it has a lot of nutrition, which I think is important. And we've also done quite a bit of reforestation. I think in the last couple of years, we've planted about 80,000 trees in just our small area alone. And that's both native kind of hardwoods as well as oil palms, which are native to Western Africa. So I think those are something that are really important as well. And of course, we provide technical support because there's this big gap between kind of how things operate, for farmers that are under the gun trying to make it to next harvest versus what we'd like to do in terms of a long-term perspective. And of course, compost, as Coach mentioned, is kind of like our supercharged way to increase fertility and reverse climate change. So here's some of the things we're doing compost-wise. So there's some also policy issues that I also want to bring up that are in many ways kind of low-hanging fruit, but even easier said than done. Right now, both in Europe and the United States, we're spending a lot of money in supports in the marketplace and subsidies for biofuels, which are net energy losers, and they're big emitters of greenhouse gases. One thing people have discussed of late are CAFOs, concentrated animal feeding operations, which are feedlots. So not only do they emit, through this kind of manure lagoons and everything else, methane, for example, but they're the end point of this industrial food chain, which starts with GMO seed and ends up with really poor quality meat. And one thing we've talked about a lot at Farewell Project is whether or not we should include plantations, monocrops into the fair trade system. Should we reward and provide a premium for a system that necessarily is not as holistic as we want moving forward? So this is kind of a big question that's being discussed currently. But some on the positive side, which I think is really hopeful and exciting, is that really the action in the United States on climate change, and particularly urban agriculture, is really at the city and the municipal level. So there's all sorts of things that are happening right now that I think are really great and exciting. So for example, San Francisco just passed a law which allows for rezoning, which means you could basically get a lower tax rate if you were able to have a portion or all of your land zoned as agriculture. So there's some different ways we can do in terms of push and pull that I think are really exciting. One project we worked on maybe about 10 years ago in Woodbury County, Iowa, which is not exactly San Francisco, they were pushing through an economic development program which would provide tax breaks if farmers converted to organic and then supplied local institutions. So I think there's a lot of really neat models out there. Now we just got to get the people behind them and push them. Certainly institutional policy is great. In terms of the biggest purchasers of food in the United States, it's the government, really. The Defense Department, schools, hospitals, those types of things. And if we really start to focus and provide preferences to that, I think we can really drive the marketplace and support farmers in the process. Retail, we talk a lot about different purchasing preferences on the retail side, but I think if there was some leadership there as it relates to climate change, not that anybody in the room would be interested in that, but maybe some way we can provide some support as well. And then the other thing is how do we scale up this model practically speaking? There's this sweet spot between traditional knowledge and all of the research that folks like Rodale are doing. So we really need to provide some public support for that, shift away some of the subsidies that we're doing at the university level towards GMOs and that type of thing for regenerative organic ag or agroecology. And then finally, something really practical everybody can do is at the family level. I mean, if you just did vermicompost with all your food waste, that I think is a really important first step. It's easy and it really connects you back to kind of the farmer for those of us that live in urban areas. And then finally, public policy I think is really a big issue. We spend a lot of money, especially public subsidies, on a system that is not exactly beneficial and actually part of the problem. So those are a couple of things. And then finally, as Coach mentioned, on Tuesday there's going to be an emergency UN special meeting on climate change. And you'll have representatives from industry there, government, what have you. But the big thing is that we want our voices at the table. Farmers, research, advocates, and others. Because as the saying goes, if you are not at the table, you're on the menu. So we've got the march coming up on Sunday. For those of you that haven't heard, this will be the biggest mobilization in history on climate change. And out of this, not unlike the anti-war movement or some of these other big mobilizations like the WTO March in 1999 in Seattle, out of that came this historic opportunity. So this is our opportunity. People that don't talk about climate change are going to start talking about it and unraveling it a little bit more. So really this is kind of our opportunity. And I know a handful of us will be at the march on Sunday, but really moving forward, the starting gun starts now. So thank you very much.